It will be a Thanksgiving weekend of frantic diplomacy as Canada tries to head off a potential escalation in tensions with India. CBC News has confirmed that India has given Canada a deadline of Tuesday to reduce its diplomatic presence in India. The demand is for Canada to remove about 40 diplomats from the country. If not, India is threatening to revoke the diplomatic immunity of Canadian officials who don't leave. Canada has removed some of its staff from India as tensions have escalated in recent weeks. As staff located outside of Delhi who might not have full diplomatic immunity have relocated to Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. To dig into this, Roland Paris is the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and a former senior advisor on foreign policy to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Thomas Juneau is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa specializing in security and intelligence. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Roland, I wonder if we can start with you. What are the implications of these demands from India should they follow through on their threats?
Well, I think we have to wait and see what happens. There are moments when dealing with things diplomatically behind the scenes makes the most sense rather than dealing with them up front publicly and raising tensions, et cetera. This is probably one of those moments. The rules governing diplomats, there is a convention out there. I'm not a lawyer, but there are procedures built into that convention. So I think India would want to be a country that was seen to be following all the rules of the conventions governing the handling of diplomats and diplomacy. So let's just see how this actually turns out a few days from now.
Yeah, Thomas, Canada is definitely playing this slow and quiet, right? Focusing on diplomacy, not saying anything aggravating in public on this. What are your thoughts on what we're hearing India is demanding of Canada?
At this point, it seems to me, but as Roland says, based on incomplete information on our side, it's difficult to say with any kind of certainty, but it seems to me that it is the right approach for Canada to really play it as quiet as possible, as low profile as possible, and to focus the messaging in private, but also in public, on the need to de-escalate. We don't have an interest, we don't have the capability to win an escalation with India, so it's not in our interest. That being said, there is a bit of a risk here. It's increasingly clear, including with those news coming out today, that India does want to escalate. And if Canada is perceived too much, not only by India, but by others too, as being too intent on playing it quiet and trying to de-escalate, that can be perceived as weakness. That can be perceived as Canada being able to be bullied around by India, by Saudi Arabia 5 years ago. So there is a message here that Canada does have to be mindful of that is being sent more broadly and farther down the road that we do have to be careful with.
Right. So Roland, we have seen, in diplomatic disputes in the past, people get PNG'd, declared persona non grata, and they're asked to leave the country in a set amount of time. I have never seen anyone threaten to revoke diplomatic immunity for people who aren't voluntarily removed by the government, as we're hearing India is asking to do. I mean, what would be the international reaction, do you think, if the rules of the Vienna Convention were just kind of discounted by the world's biggest democracy?
Yeah, and it's a good question about the international reaction. And again, there are procedures set out in that convention, and I wouldn't expect the Canadian government to be making blustery statements at this moment, while it's not exactly clear what India is actually going to do. And, I think that the government has indicated that there are conversations that are still happening between the two governments. I have no doubt that there is a lot of diplomacy taking place behind the scenes, not just with India, but with many other countries, third parties, and partners of Canada. And your question about, what would the international reaction be? Listen, India wants to strengthen its relations with lots of parts of the world, including with the Western countries that are now seeking to strengthen their relations with India for economic and strategic reasons. India does not want to be seen as a country that flouts rules wantonly. And so, I think that India is likely to be mindful of what the international reaction is going to be in this circumstance. Let's just hope that that's true.
Well, Thomas, Roland makes the point that India doesn't want to be seen as a country that flouts rules, but the Prime Minister did implicate them in an extrajudicial killing in Parliament, and now here we are with this. So, I mean, how would you even begin to describe the state of the diplomatic relations between the two countries as this is escalated?
Oh, I mean, the state of Canada-India diplomatic relations have taken a serious downturn, and there's no doubt about that. I think there's two kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves on that basis. A, beyond managing the crisis in the short term, as we just laid out, how do we farther down the road try to repair these relations? That is going to take time, and that's increasingly clear. The fact that, as Roland just said, Canada, as its other Western allies, has an interest in economically and strategically deepening relations with India, fundamentally that has not changed. Beyond that, the other question that I hope we are asking ourselves internally in the government is, given the fact that the main pillar of our new Indo-Pacific strategy, India, will not act as that pillar, at least for the short, possibly the midterm, what do we do in the Indo-Pacific region? Should we try to refocus some efforts towards Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, beyond India? Because at least for now, that's a bit of a closed door.
Well, and Roland, just to, I guess to underscore how fraught things are right now, a bunch of diplomats or diplomatic staff who might not have full diplomatic immunity, who worked in, say, Canadian consulates and whatever outside of Delhi, they've relocated to Kuala Lumpur, they've relocated to Singapore as these tensions have escalated. That in itself strikes me as a pretty alarming sign about where things are going right now on the Indo-Canadian relationship.
Yeah, I think that relations are very strained right now. I mean, in contrast to the situation we had with the terrible situation with China and the two Michaels, my understanding is that Canada and India are continuing to talk, but there's no doubt that, if India was responsible for assassinating a Canadian citizen on Canadian territory, the Canadian government is not going to forget about that. They're not just going to let it, they're not going to brush it off. I do think that they're playing a longer game right now. There is a criminal investigation underway. I suspect, just a personal view, eventually this information will make its way into the public domain. I would expect that there's ongoing diplomacy with partners. And I would expect that countries like the United States are communicating to India their concern about this. And so I think that this is just one of these situations where I think that there's probably a lot going on behind the scenes that will only become clearer as time unfolds.
No, certainly that was the impression I came away with my conversations with various officials in various levels of government today, that there's a lot happening, so they're not saying a thing because obviously they would like a diplomatic resolution to this rather than the escalation. And so, Thomas, what could Canada say to India at this point? In the 3 to 4 days that they have left, do you think, well, what's the sort of approach they could take to try to stop this from happening?
This is a really difficult question to answer, given, as Roland just said, that there's so much that we don't know that is presumably happening behind the scenes. So what has been said, what has not been said? I think in the very, very short term, it's mostly a matter of being in crisis management mode and trying to limit the damage to relocating staff and so on. One thing that Canada presumably, again, has been doing, but it does play a really important role here, is talking to allies. We do know, given a variety of declarations, that we have been talking to the Americans, we have been talking to the British and so on. They have their own interest in a deepening relations with India, so they are reluctant to be seen as taking our side too much. But if you read between the lines, notably on the American side, there is concern with India's actions. And if we take a couple steps back, India in the last few months, last couple of years, has taken a much more assertive, sometimes much more aggressive, very nationalist term in terms of its foreign policy, domestically too, in terms of its respect for minorities and human rights and the democratic process and so on. So there is a broader conversation here that Canada can have with its allies to try to build at least some support on our side.
Yeah, so Roland, on that, we've heard that the US, the UK, Australia, they've all spoken to India and encouraged them to cooperate in the criminal investigation related to the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Is that also the approach on calming diplomatic tensions when it comes to consular staff and diplomatic staff, having your allies lean in with India, or is this a problem Canada has to solve directly?
Oh, I'm sure that, I don't know, but I'd be very surprised if there wasn't active diplomacy with Canadian allies and third parties talking to the Indians about this. And I would think that the constructive way of trying to avert the worst here would be to focus on the terms of the convention and to reiterate the importance of India operating in a way that's consistent with international rules and norms, which it purports to uphold, and to have allies communicating the same message. There's been a lot of attention to the fact that a lot of our allies want to strengthen relations with India for their own economic and strategic reasons. Canada, for that matter, has until recently been trying to strengthen relations with India for the same reasons. But let's not mistake the fact that India also has a very strong interest in pursuing those relationships. And to the extent that these actions have the potential to cause problems within those relationships, and I think that they are causing some problems in those relationships, then I think working through allies and with other partners can be beneficial to Canada.
So, Thomas, just on a final point, I mean, India is obviously playing hardball diplomatically. We've also seen this torrent of misinformation and disinformation coming out of India media sources about cocaine on the Prime Minister's plane and a bunch of other things that seem designed to sort of distract from the central allegation of a potential Indian role in a murder. What do you think India is trying to do here? What signals do you think you're trying to send to Canada? What signals do you think you're trying to send to other countries?
So that's a really important question. First of all, there is a dimension to that signaling by India that is very domestic. The base of Prime Minister Modi's, domestically is very much on the right-wing Hindu nationalist side. So he does, and that base is heavily mobilized right now. So that is an element that very much pushes Modi in one clear direction of continuing this. Beyond that, and I think the important point for Canada here, and here there is a parallel to make with the dispute we had with Saudi Arabia in 2018, that yes, in a way, this is about Canada. There's a very specific dispute between the two countries on the issue of Sikh activism in this country. We know that. That is absolutely true. There's a disagreement at that level. But beyond that, there is a message that India is sending here to other Western democracies, but to the world beyond Western democracies. We are a rising power. You need to take our interests much more seriously. You cannot push us around. And in that sense, Canada is collateral damage. We are not the United States. We are not a member of the European Union. We're kind of alone in between. That was a similar dynamic with Saudi Arabia 5 years ago. That puts us in a vulnerable position. And my fear is that this is a situation that could very well repeat itself in the future with another country, whether a partner like India or Saudi Arabia, or a non-partner adversary like China or another one.
Well, Roland, just as a final point, your take on that, because it also is an echo of what we were told when the two Michaels, when Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor was taken, is that they were sending a message to America using us as the example.
Yeah, I think that India is also probably getting a message back, and I wouldn't underestimate how significant that can be from parties that India has a very strong interest in developing relations with. But it's true that there is a danger here, and the larger strategic vulnerability could be of Canada becoming an easy mark, so to speak. And that's something that we cannot allow to happen. And that means that we have to both be, there's a home game and an away game aspect to this. The home game is we have to strengthen our capacity to detect and disrupt these kinds of coercive measures that might be taking place in Canada against the Canadian government or against Canadian citizens. And secondly, our away game, we have to be working with our allies as much as possible in order to create deterrence. And, this is part of the world we're living in. We just don't have the same kind of protection that we used to have. We have to get used to it. We have to work within that world, and we have to be able to push back when necessary.